There is a stretch of river in the Pacific Northwest that most people have never heard of. It doesn't appear on popular hiking maps. The locals who live near it rarely talk about it to outsiders, and those who have camped along its banks tend to keep their experiences quiet, not out of secrecy, but out of something closer to reverence or fear. I had heard about this place through a friend of a friend, a geologist who spent 3 weeks mapping the watershed and came back looking like she had aged a decade. She wouldn't tell me exactly what happened out there. She said only that the river had its own rules, and that anyone who camped beside it long enough would learn what those rules were the hard way. I had been planning a solo trip for months, a proper backcountry experience, far from roads, far from cell towers, far from the low-level noise of modern life that follows you everywhere, like a shadow you can't shake. I wanted silence. I wanted distance. I wanted to be genuinely alone with the land, and with whatever version of myself emerged when all the familiar comforts were stripped away. If that sounds like the beginning of a bad decision, it probably was. But it was also the beginning of the most extraordinary experience of my life, one that I am still trying to fully understand. If you want to follow this journey and hear more stories from the deep places of the world, hit subscribe right now. There are more of these out there, and every single one of them changes the way you look at the land beneath your feet. The drive out took almost 6 hours. I left before dawn, while the city was still folded into darkness and the streets were wet from overnight rain. My truck was loaded with everything I had carefully selected over the previous 2 weeks. A 4-season tent rated to -15. A sleeping bag I had tested in temperatures far colder than I expected to encounter. A water filtration system, a bear canister with 9 days of food, a first aid kit that a wilderness medicine instructor had helped me build from scratch, a handheld GPS unit with topo maps downloaded, a paper map as backup, a compass, a headlamp with 4 extra sets of batteries. I had done this before. I knew what I was doing, or at least I believed that I did. The road deteriorated steadily as I drove north and east. What began as a 2-lane highway became a single-lane forest road, then a gravel track, then something that barely qualified as a track at all. I parked at the end of a logging spur that had been abandoned years ago, judging by the young alders growing up through the gravel. From there, it was a 12-kilometer hike to the river, carrying everything on my back. The forest closed around me within minutes of leaving the truck. Old-growth Douglas fir, some of them 3 or 4 meters in diameter at the base, rising like cathedral columns into a canopy so dense that the midday light filtering through it had a green, underwater quality. The understory was thick with sword fern and devil's club and Oregon grape. The trail, such as it was, had been maintained by animals rather than people. I followed deer tracks mostly, and twice crossed the fresh prints of something much larger that I did not stop to identify. The river announced itself before I could see it. I heard it first, a deep, constant roar that seemed to rise out of the bedrock itself, rather than from the water moving over it. Then I smelled it, that particular cold mineral scent of fast-moving mountain water, carrying silt and dissolved stone from somewhere much higher and much older than the forest around me. Then I came through a stand of red cedar, and there it was. It was bigger than I had expected. The descriptions I had been given suggested a medium-sized river, manageable in terms of crossing, picturesque in terms of camping. What I found was something considerably more imposing. The water was running high and fast from recent snowmelt, a deep jade green in the main channel, white and violent where it broke over the boulders that punctuated the riverbed. The opposite bank was 30 or 40 meters away, across water that was moving with the kind of purpose that drowns confident swimmers. I found a site on a gravel bar about 2 meters above the waterline. The bar was broad and flat, sheltered on the upstream side by a massive spruce that had fallen across the bank sometime in the past decade, its root ball still attached to the earth, creating a natural windbreak 6 meters high. Downstream, the river bent around a rocky point and disappeared from view. Upstream, I could see perhaps 200 meters before the channel curved again. On the far side, the bank rose steeply into forest. Nothing moved over there that I could see. But I had the persistent and entirely irrational feeling that something was watching from that dark tree line. I set up camp methodically, tent first, staked firmly into the gravel with extra guy lines, because the site was exposed to the river corridor, and I expected wind. Then I hung my food and scent items from a branch 15 meters from the tent, using a system a bear biologist had once shown me that involves 2 separate ropes and a pulley mechanism that makes it nearly impossible for even the most persistent bear to retrieve the bag. I filtered water. I cooked a hot meal. I sat in the fading light and listened to the river and tried to feel the peace I had come here to find. It came, eventually. The kind of deep, cellular relaxation that only arrives when you have been genuinely outside for several hours, with physical effort involved, and no screens and no voices. The quality of the silence around the river's constant roar is paradoxical. The water is enormously loud, but it is also completely consistent, completely non-threatening, a white noise that fills in all the anxious frequencies and leaves you with something that feels remarkably close to calm. I was in my tent by 9 o'clock. Fully dark by then, the forest beyond the gravel bar and absolute blackness against the slightly lighter sky. I lay in my sleeping bag and listened. The river, wind moving through the upper branches, the occasional creak of the fallen spruce settling. I was asleep within 20 minutes. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. Somewhere in the deep middle of the night, that hour when the darkness feels most complete and the brain is at its most uncertain about what is real. I woke up suddenly, without the gradual surfacing that normally accompanies waking from deep sleep. One moment I was unconscious, and the next I was completely, acutely awake, heart already elevated, listening with everything I had. Something was moving through the tent. Not outside the tent, not brushing against the fabric from the outside. Inside, through the interior space. I could hear it and I could feel it, a displacement of air, a subtle pressure change, as though something was passing through the enclosed space of the tent, in a way that should have been physically impossible. The nylon walls were not moving. Nothing was touching me, but there was an unmistakable sense of presence and motion in that small, sealed space. I lay completely still. My hand found my headlamp by instinct, muscle memory from 100 previous camp mornings. I did not turn it on. I kept listening. The sound was difficult to describe. It was lower than wind, lower than the tent fabric moving. It had a texture to it, almost organic, almost rhythmic, like breathing that was just below the threshold of what you could definitively call breathing. Then it stopped. For perhaps 30 seconds there was nothing but the river and my own heartbeat. Then, from beneath me, from the gravel and rock and earth beneath the tent footprint, came a vibration. It started so subtly that I initially thought I was imagining it. A faint trembling, almost imperceptible, like the distant passage of a heavy truck on a road far away. But there was no road, there was no truck. There was nothing out here that should have been producing that vibration, and it was growing. Slowly, steadily, with the patient authority of something that had been building for a very long time, the ground beneath me began to shake. Not violently, not the way you imagine an earthquake from disaster film footage, buildings cracking, glass shattering, the earth opening in great theatrical splits. This was different. This was a deep, rolling, fundamental shaking, as though the bedrock itself was being slowly turned, as though the mountains were adjusting their position relative to each other, and the forest and the river and my small tent were simply along for the ride. I unzipped the tent in one fast motion and stepped out onto the gravel bar. The world was moving. The river was changing. Even in the darkness I could see it, could hear it in the altered pitch of the water, a sudden surge of volume and turbulence. The gravel beneath my feet was vibrating in a way that traveled up through my legs and into my chest. The fallen spruce was groaning. Deep in the forest, on both sides of the river, I could hear trees swaying and snapping, the sound of the canopy in violent motion, without any wind. I grabbed my boots, I grabbed my headlamp, and the small emergency pack I always keep immediately inside the tent door, a habit drilled into me by years of backcountry travel. I did not go for my main pack. I did not try to break camp. Every piece of training I had absorbed told me that in a seismic event near a river, your immediate priority is elevation. Rivers amplify ground shaking. River banks can liquefy. Gravel bars, those flat, convenient, beautiful camping spots, are made of unconsolidated material that behaves during an earthquake the way wet sand behaves when you squeeze it. I ran for the bank. The slope behind the gravel bar was steep, maybe 45 degrees, covered in exposed root systems and loose rock, and the same dense undergrowth I had been pushing through all day. I climbed it in darkness with my headlamp on, not fast enough, never feeling fast enough, grabbing at roots and hauling myself up while the ground continued its slow, deep oscillation beneath me. I got maybe 20 meters up the bank and stopped at a natural ledge where a large Douglas fir had created a small platform of accumulated soil and debris. I wrapped my arms around the base of the tree and looked down at the river. What I saw in the next few minutes is difficult to describe without sounding like I am exaggerating, and I want to be precise because precision is what this deserves. The river was changing course. Not dramatically, not the way a river changes course over centuries of gradual erosion, but noticeably, perceptibly, in real time. The main channel was pushing toward the far bank with increased force. The gravel bar where my tent was sitting had begun to look smaller. Water was moving around its edges in places that had been dry ground minutes before. The shaking lasted, by my best estimate, somewhere between 90 seconds and 3 minutes. In a seismic event, time becomes unreliable. The brain processes it differently, stretching certain moments and compressing others. What I can say with certainty is that it was long enough to feel like it had intention, long enough to feel like it was making a point. When it stopped, the silence was extraordinary, or rather the relative silence, because the river was louder than it had been, running higher and faster and with more agitation than before the shaking began. But the forest had gone quiet. Every bird, every insect, every unseen creature in the undergrowth had fallen absolutely mute. The sudden transition from the crackling, groaning, vibrating chaos of the earthquake to this dense, waiting quiet was one of the most unsettling sensory experiences I have ever had. I stayed on that ledge for a long time. Long enough for feeling to return to my hands. Long enough for my heart rate to come back down to something approaching normal. Long enough for the forest to begin, tentatively, incrementally, to resume its nighttime sounds. Then I started thinking clearly enough to go back for my tent. The gravel bar was still there, reduced slightly on the downstream edge where the river had carved a new channel around the point, but fundamentally intact. My tent was still standing, which surprised me. The stakes had held, the extra guy lines had done their job. My food bag was still hanging in its tree. My main pack was where I had left it. I sat on a flat rock at the edge of the bar and drank water, and tried to piece together what had happened, in the order it had happened, because the order mattered. Something moving through the tent. Then the ground shaking. These are two separate events, apparently, one mysterious, one explicable. Seismic events happen in this part of the Pacific Northwest regularly. The Cascadia subduction zone, one of the most seismically active fault systems on the continent, runs just offshore. Smaller events, magnitude 2, 3, 4, happen constantly in this region, most too small to feel, some large enough to wake you from sleep. What I had experienced was probably a magnitude 4 or low 5 event, large enough to be alarming, not large enough to be catastrophic. The geology explains the shaking entirely. But the geology does not explain what happened before the shaking. I have spent a great deal of time since that night reading about animal perception of seismic events. It is well documented that many animals sense earthquakes before humans do. Dogs become agitated, cattle move to higher ground, birds take flight, fish behave erratically. The mechanism is not fully understood, but the most compelling theory involves low-frequency acoustic waves, infrasound, generated by the stress building in rock before it releases as seismic energy. These waves travel through the ground and through the air at frequencies below the threshold of human hearing. We cannot detect them consciously, but they affect us. There is research suggesting that humans sometimes experience physiological responses to infrasound without understanding what they are perceiving, a feeling of unease, elevated heart rate, the sense of being watched, the sense of presence. And here is where things become genuinely interesting from a scientific standpoint. There is also research suggesting that enclosed spaces, particularly small enclosed spaces like tents, can function as resonance chambers for infrasound. The waves enter the space and interact with the air inside in ways that can produce perceptible effects. Movement, pressure changes, a sense that something is passing through the space that should not be there. A tent beside a river, with the river providing constant background vibration and a seismic event beginning to build in the rock beneath, would be close to an ideal set of conditions for exactly the phenomenon I experienced. The something moving through the tent may have been infrasound, may have been the very early subsonic leading edge of the seismic event, perceived by my sleeping brain as presence, as motion, as something alive passing through my space. I say may have been. I want to be honest about the limits of my certainty here, because the experience of it, the felt reality of those moments in the dark, with my hand on my headlamp and something moving through the air of that sealed tent, did not feel like physics. It felt like encounter. It felt like something that knew I was there. I stayed awake until the sky began to lighten. Not vigilantly, not in fear, but in a state of alert attention that I have experienced a few times before in the backcountry and have come to think of as the brain doing something it does not often get the opportunity to do, which is to attend fully to the immediate physical world without the interference of future planning or past regret. Just listening, just noticing, just being present in a landscape that is genuinely, consequentially alive. As the light came back, the forest came back with it. First the birds, the varied thrush with its single, minor key whistle that sounds like someone calling from very far away. Then the ravens, moving along the river corridor with their complicated, almost conversational calls. Then the smaller birds, wrens and chickadees, and the sharp percussion of a woodpecker working a dead snag on the far bank. The river settled back toward its pre-earthquake character, still high and fast and cold, but no longer agitated in the same way. The gravel bar dried in the morning air. The world reassembled itself. I made coffee and sat with it, and looked at the river, and thought about the night. There is a particular quality of attention that the wilderness demands, and it is not something you can sustain continuously in ordinary life. It requires genuine uncertainty. It requires a landscape that has not been fully domesticated, that retains the capacity to surprise and disorient, and occasionally frighten you. Cities are designed to eliminate that quality of attention. Roads and buildings and artificial light and the constant presence of other humans create an environment in which you are never truly uncertain about what might happen next within the next few minutes. The range of possibilities has been narrowed to something manageable and mostly predictable. Out here, beside this river, with the memory of the night still in my body, the range of possibilities felt enormous. And that was not, when I sat with it honestly, an unpleasant feeling. It was more like waking up, more like remembering something important that ordinary life had allowed me to forget. I spent 4 more days on that river. The aftershocks came, 3 of them, all small, all at night, all felt as brief shiverings of the ground that lasted only a few seconds. After the first night, I was not frightened by them. They had become part of the landscape, part of the river's character, part of the ongoing conversation between the rock and the water, and the fault systems buried deep beneath both. This is not a stable landscape. It is not meant to be stable. The whole Pacific coast of this continent is in constant, slow-motion collision with the oceanic plate pushing beneath it, and the mountains and the rivers and the forests are all expressions of that collision, all shaped by forces that operate on timescales so vast that a human life doesn't even register as a measurement. On the second day, I found evidence of a much older seismic event, a section of the far bank, about 500 meters upstream, where the entire cliff face had sheared away sometime in the past, leaving a raw exposure of fractured rock and compressed soil layers that told the story of a massive landslide. The rockfall had partially dammed the river at some point, creating a debris field that still forced the water through a narrow, turbulent chute even now, decades or possibly centuries after the event. The trees growing in the landslide debris were younger than the trees on either side of it, their trunks smaller in diameter, their root systems still shallow in the unconsolidated material. A river is a record of everything that has happened to the land around it. Every earthquake, every landslide, every flood, every drought is written in the channel shape, the bank composition, the distribution of boulders and gravel bars and log jams. You learn to read it if you spend enough time looking. You start to see the history and the geography. You start to understand that what looks like a fixed, permanent feature, this river, this valley, this particular configuration of rock and water and forest, is actually a snapshot of an ongoing process, a frame from a film that has been running for millions of years and will continue running long after every structure humans have ever built has been dissolved back into the elements. On the third day, I saw a black bear on the far bank. She was working her way downstream along the water's edge, pausing every few meters to investigate something in the shallows, turning rocks with one paw in search of whatever lay beneath. She was not large, probably a young female, her coat the deep, almost blue-black of a healthy animal in summer condition. She did not notice me for a long time. When she finally did, stopping and lifting her nose and turning her head to assess the unfamiliar scent coming from my direction. There was no drama. She looked at me for perhaps 15 seconds, then looked away, and continued downstream, and rounded the point, and was gone. That is how most wildlife encounters actually happen, when you are far enough from roads and trails that the animals have not been conditioned to fear or approach human beings. Without that conditioning, the encounter is simply two animals assessing each other and determining that neither presents an immediate problem for the other. It is brief and matter-of-fact, and somehow all the more remarkable for its ordinariness. The salmon were beginning to show in the deeper pools. Not many yet, the run was just starting, but every few minutes I could see the dark shapes of large fish holding in the current, facing upstream, resting from the effort of fighting against the flow, preparing for the next push. Coho, I thought, judging by the shape and size, though I am not a fisheries biologist and the light on the water makes identification uncertain, watching them held something I find difficult to articulate. There is something about the salmon migration that reduces the scale of human concerns to appropriate dimensions. These fish have come from the open Pacific, hundreds of kilometers of ocean, navigating by senses we do not fully understand, returning to the specific tributary, the specific pool, the specific gravel bed where they hatched, to complete the cycle that is the only purpose their biology has assigned them. They will spawn and they will die, and their bodies will feed the river ecosystem, the insects and the invertebrates and the fish and the birds and the bears and the trees, in a chain of consequence that connects the deep ocean to the mountain forest in a single unbroken thread. I found myself thinking about the night again, about the thing that moved through the tent before the ground shook, about infrasound and resonance chambers and the limits of human sensory perception, about what it means to be in a landscape that can communicate with you through channels you did not know you had. There is a school of thought in ecology and environmental philosophy that argues we have spent so much time and effort building environments that filter out the wild world that we have effectively blinded and deafened ourselves to dimensions of experience that our ancestors lived in continuously. Hunter-gatherers in the landscape that produced our species did not have the option of ignoring infrasound, or ignoring the behavioral cues of animals, or ignoring the way a forest sounds differently in the hours before a major weather event or a seismic shift. These were not mystical perceptions. They were practical, survival-critical information. They were the landscape speaking and the people in the landscape listening, because their lives depended on the quality of their attention. We still have those capacities. They have not been engineered out of our biology, only out of our daily practice. When you spend enough consecutive nights in a place like this river valley, they start to come back, not with dramatic suddenness, not as revelation, but as gradual, quiet return, like a sense that has been neglected, beginning to sharpen again with use. By the fourth night, I was sleeping differently, not more lightly, not more anxiously, but more broadly, if that makes any sense. More aware, even in sleep, of the range of sounds and sensations around me. I woke twice in the night to sounds that turned out to be a Roosevelt elk moving through the forest margin upstream, an animal I had been hearing for 2 days without seeing, judging by the scale of the sounds and the occasional crashing through undergrowth. The third time I woke, there was nothing I could identify. Just the river, and the darkness, and a feeling that was not quite unease but was not quite comfort either, a feeling that was simply alertness. The appropriate state for a human animal sleeping on the ground in a landscape that is genuinely, fundamentally wild. The morning of the 5th day, I packed my camp and hiked out. The 12 kilometers back to the truck felt shorter than the hike in, the way return journeys often do, the landscape now familiar enough that my brain was processing it differently, storing less of it as new information, allowing me to move through it with a certain efficiency. I was tired in a clean way. The kind of tiredness that comes from physical effort and interrupted sleep, and genuine sustained attention, rather than from the particular grinding exhaustion of screen time, and indoor air, and social obligation. I reached the truck in the early afternoon, sat in the driver's seat for a while without starting the engine, tried to hold on to the quality of attention the river had given me, knowing it would fade, knowing the city would begin to reclaim it the moment I turned the key. I have been back to that river twice since that first trip. Both times I camped on the same gravel bar, in the same spot. Both times I set up the same tent, with the same extra guy lines staked into the same gravel. Both times I lay in the dark and listened to the river and felt the ground beneath me and waited, with something between hope and apprehension, for the night to offer whatever it had to offer. The ground did not shake again, not on either subsequent visit. The seismic quiet in the region had returned to its baseline, the fault system apparently satisfied for now with the adjustment it had made on that first night. But on the second return visit, on the second night, sleeping alone on that gravel bar with the river running high and fast and the forest pressing in from three sides, I felt it again. That thing moving through the tent. That displacement of air, that pressure change, that sense of something passing through the enclosed space in a way that should have been impossible. I did not panic. I did not unzip the tent and run for the bank. I lay still and breathed slowly and paid attention with everything I had. And after a minute, or 3 minutes, or 5, it passed, and the ground did not shake, and the river continued unchanged, and the forest continued in its nighttime business around me. I have no explanation for what it was. That second time without a seismic event to follow. I have a list of possibilities. Animals brushing against the tent exterior in a way that produced internal air movement. Some quirk of wind patterns in the river corridor, creating pressure differentials around the tent. Infrasound from the river itself, or from distant traffic, or from some geological process too deep and too slow to register as a perceptible earthquake. My own brain, pattern matching to the memory of the first night, generating the sensation from expectation. All of these are plausible. None of them feel entirely sufficient, and perhaps that is the most honest place to land. In a landscape as genuinely complex and as genuinely old as that river valley, in a region where the bedrock is being remade by forces that have been operating for 50 million years, in conditions that strip away the comfortable certainty of the built environment and leave you with the raw sensory experience of being a biological creature on a living planet. Perhaps the most honest response to something you cannot fully explain is not to force it into an explanation, but to simply note that it happened, that it mattered, that it changed something in the way you understand your relationship to the world around you. The river has its own rules. The geologist who warned me about this was right about that, even if the rules turned out to be the rules of geology and hydrology and the biology of infrasound perception and the behavior of an uncertain landscape in the hours before seismic release. They are rules older than any human system of thought. They are the rules of a planet that was already ancient when the first of our ancestors stood upright on the savanna and looked at the horizon and wondered what was out there. Going out there is still worth it. Going to the places where the rules change, where the ground shakes and the air moves inside a sealed tent and a black bear turns her nose toward you and decides you are not worth her attention. Going to the places where the salmon are making their impossible journey, and the trees are recording the history of earthquakes in the rings of their wood, and the river is speaking in frequencies too low for the ordinary human ear to resolve into language. It is worth going there because of what comes back with you. Not the photographs, not the data, not the story you tell afterward at a dinner table while people look at their phones. What comes back is subtler than all of that. A recalibration, a sense of appropriate scale. A quiet and persistent memory of what it felt like to lie on the ground in the dark and feel the world moving beneath you, and understand, in a way that no amount of reading or watching or listening to other people's accounts can produce, that the planet is alive in ways that most of us have stopped paying attention to. Pay attention. That is the only instruction the river ever gives. Pay attention and stay close to the high ground and listen for the things that move before you can explain why they are moving. Your body knows more than you think it does. It was built for exactly this. The last animal sound I heard on that first morning, walking away from the gravel bar with my pack on my back and the river receding behind me, was a raven calling from somewhere high in the canopy. A single, clear note, repeated 3 times, then silence. I do not know what it meant. I am not sure it meant anything, in the sense of intentional communication directed at me. But I heard it as punctuation, as the landscape's closing remark on what had passed between us in the night. I walked out through the old growth and the sword fern, and the October light filtered green through the Douglas fir canopy, and I carried the river's rules with me, and I carry them still. If these places matter to you, if the wild edges of the world matter to you, if the stories that the land keeps in its rocks and its rivers and its deep, unpredictable geology matter to you, then stay close. There are more of these stories. The landscape keeps producing them for anyone willing to sleep on the ground and listen long enough and not look away when the darkness starts moving. Subscribe and stay with this. The world is larger than we remember, and older, and more alive, and it has been waiting with extraordinary patience for us to pay it the attention it deserves.